The morning sun had barely risen over the border town of Busia when truck drivers began lining up engines humming like a restless choir. These men, ordinary workers who feed East Africa's entire economy, watched the road nervously whispering about a rumor that traveled faster than any cargo they carried. Uganda's president, Yoweri Museveni, now nearly 4 decades in power, had just declared that the Indian Ocean belongs to me, and in the future we are going to have wars because of it. For people who depend on the Mombasa port for fuel, food, medicine, and every strand of daily life, it felt like hearing a siren echo across a quiet street. Not a physical alarm, but a political one. A warning that something deep beneath the surface had shifted. Museveni's words were delivered during his new campaign pitch as he seeks yet another term in 2026. His tone was raw, almost impatient, as he described the endless frustrations of a landlocked country negotiating with Kenya for railways, pipelines, and access to the sea. But when he crossed the line and claimed ownership of the Indian Ocean East, Africa felt a tremor. Not because war was imminent, but because history teaches that conflicts often begin with words spoken at the wrong moment by a leader with everything to gain and nothing left to lose. Kenya's Ministry of Foreign Affairs quickly responded, trying to calm the waters. They insisted Museveni understood international law. They insisted nothing alarming had happened. Yet the region's security analysts warned leaders don't casually talk about future wars. So the question for us watching from afar is simple but unsettling. Was Museveni speaking from frustration? Or was he revealing a dangerous truth about the future of East Africa? Before we explore the layers behind these remarks, I want to hear from you. Do you believe a statement like this is just politics or a sign of deeper instability? And if you value clear, honest reporting about Africa beyond the headlines, please subscribe. Your support helps keep stories like this alive long before they reach mainstream news. The dust rose gently above the Ugandan plains as President Yoweri Museveni stepped onto the stage slowly, deliberately, the way a man who has spent nearly 40 years in power often moves. The crowd gathered to hear his manifesto for the 2026 election, expecting familiar promises about stability and development. But as he began speaking, something felt different. His voice carried a sharper edge, a tone shaped by age, political fatigue, and the weight of a country that has outgrown the narratives he once relied on. Museveni spoke about the frustrations of a landlocked nation. He described how Uganda had spent decades negotiating for access to the sea through Kenya railways, pipelines, fuel routes, ports. Each project delayed, renegotiated, revised. He paused often as if reliving the decades of political bargaining, and then almost out of nowhere, his speech veered into the statement that froze the region, "That ocean belongs to me. And in the future, we are going to have wars." The crowd, stirred by national pride, erupted in cheers. But outside that venue across Uganda and Kenya, the reaction was very different. Markets fell silent. Border towns murmured with confusion, and diplomats felt their phones vibrate nonstop, because everyone understood those words were not simple campaign rhetoric. They touched the deepest fault line in East Africa, the struggle of landlocked countries to secure maritime access. At that moment, Kenya found itself at the center of a geopolitical storm it did not start. Within hours, journalists demanded a response from Nairobi. Truck drivers at Malaba and Busia border posts wondered if their routes would be disrupted. Petroleum companies quietly calculated what even a brief dispute might cost. Because Uganda depends on Kenya's port of Mombasa for 90% of its fuel supplies, a lifeline that, if interrupted, could cripple the Ugandan economy in days. When Kenya finally responded, it did so with the caution of a country that understood how quickly a regional dispute could escalate. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs offered a calm, almost diplomatic smile. Their spokesperson stated gently, "We believe President Museveni understands international law and the nature of our territory." It was a polite way of saying, "The Indian Ocean is not yours, and you know it." But the response did not remove the sting from Museveni's words. Security analysts in both countries stepped forward to explain just how dangerous such comments could be. They reminded the public that East Africa's borders are fragile, carved by colonial powers with little regard for ethnicity, geography, or long-term stability. And they warned that history shows how countries with limited access to the sea often feel trapped, dependent on neighbors vulnerable to shifting politics and exposed to economic pressure. One analyst went further, calling Museveni's statement deeply dangerous and absurd, especially given Uganda's past wars. He pointed to the battles with Tanzania Mutukula in the late 1960s and the Saba-Saba conflict of the 1970s, where Uganda suffered heavy human and material losses. Those painful memories still live in the collective consciousness of older East Africans. Meanwhile, ordinary citizens struggled to make sense of the situation. In Uganda, some saw Museveni's remarks as a bold declaration of pride. Others, especially younger voters, were uneasy, questioning why a leader seeking peace would invoke the idea of war. In Kenya, many felt disrespected, worried that this rhetoric could inflame nationalist sentiment or destabilize the East African community's fragile unity. Yet, beneath the noise, there was an underlying truth. Museveni's outburst revealed the long-standing tension between economic dependency and national dignity. It exposed how a landlocked nation like Uganda constantly negotiates its survival through external infrastructure. And it showed how a leader, after nearly 4 decades in power, may turn to emotionally charged language to reignite political loyalty. What began as a routine campaign rally had within minutes become one of the most consequential political moments in East Africa's recent history. The tension reached its peak the moment Museveni uttered the sentence that would echo across the region, and in the future, "We are going to have wars." For a few seconds, even the wind seemed to pause over the rally ground. His supporters cheered wildly, fists raised, as if they had been waiting for anyone to speak loudly about the frustrations of being a landlocked nation. But outside that crowd, fear traveled like a cold draft slipping under a closed door. In the coastal city of Mombasa, fishermen preparing their nets that evening stopped to watch the news replay the statement. To them, the Indian Ocean is not just water, it is food, culture, ancestry, and survival. The idea that a neighboring president claimed ownership of their sea felt like an intrusion, not just on territory, but on memory itself. Kenya's journalists struggled to explain how such an explosive claim could be made without triggering panic, and yet the panic was already simmering. Across Nairobi, security analysts filled television studios, each trying to decode the meaning behind the words. One analyst, visibly troubled, explained that Museveni's statement carried the scent of geopolitical desperation. He warned viewers that leaders facing elections after decades in power often resort to aggressive rhetoric to reignite a fading sense of nationalism. His voice grew heavier as he added, "History teaches us wars begin with words long before they begin with weapons." Meanwhile, social media in both countries erupted. Ugandan youth mocked the statement, saying the president was claiming oceans the way children claim playgrounds. But others defended him passionately, arguing that landlocked African countries have endured unfair restrictions for generations. The debate split communities, families, and political groups, each side interpreting the statement through their own lived frustrations. Kenya's initial reaction remained measured. Its Ministry of Foreign Affairs insisted that Museveni understood international territorial law, hoping the calm tone would diffuse the pressure. But beneath the diplomatic language, experts could sense the unease. Kenya is the region's main transit hub. Fuel, medicine, food, and industrial goods all move through Mombasa. Any hint of conflict threatens the stability of not just Kenya, but all of East Africa. In Uganda, opposition leaders seized the moment. One of them argued that Museveni's words revealed a leader exhausted, cornered, and reaching for dangerous emotional triggers. He questioned why a president who has held power since 1986 would suddenly speak of future wars. Was it political theater or a genuine reflection of internal strain within Uganda's economy? The regional reaction grew even more complicated when long-standing maritime disputes resurfaced in public conversation. Memories of Magingo Island, a tiny rock in Lake Victoria claimed by both Uganda and Kenya, returned with intensity. The island, barely large enough to walk across, had sparked diplomatic hostility for over a decade. Museveni's new comments, combined with that history, made citizens on both sides anxious about whether another conflict might emerge under the guise of territorial correction. But the most sobering analysis came from experts in international law. They reminded the public that Article 125 of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS, already grants Uganda legal access to the ocean through Kenya. No force, no conflict, no war, just international agreements, bilateral routes, and mutual respect. Their message was simple: Museveni's frustration may be real, but his interpretation of ownership is not. Even so, their reassurances did little to quiet the emotional shockwave. In East Africa, where borders are fragile and economies deeply intertwined, words spoken by a powerful leader even casually carry immense weight. Every business owner, every truck driver, every policy analyst understood what was truly at stake: stability. By the end of the week, one truth became impossible to ignore. Museveni's statement was more than a campaign slogan. It had become a test of diplomacy, of regional unity, and of whether East Africa could remain calm when one of its oldest leaders decided to speak in the language of confrontation. As Museveni's words continued to ripple through the region, the first people to feel the tremor were not diplomats or generals. They were the everyday citizens living along the arteries of East African trade. In the border town of Malaba, long lines of trucks sat idle as drivers leaned against their vehicles, staring at their radios with uneasy expressions. These men understood better than anyone that a political quarrel in Kampala or Nairobi could instantly reshape the cost of fuel, food, and survival. Uganda's reliance on Kenya for 90% of its refined petroleum made every rumor of tension feel like a shadow passing over their daily bread. For families in Kampala, the anxiety was equally palpable. Mothers buying cooking oil murmured about how quickly prices could climb if border procedures became even slightly strained. Store owners worried about whether suppliers might hold back shipments until the situation calmed. It wasn't war that frightened them, it was the slow, suffocating rise of everyday costs. A single political misstep could mean nights without electricity, days without affordable fuel, or a return to the rolling shortages the country had once endured. On the Kenyan side, the concerns took a different shape. In Mombasa, shopkeepers along the docks wondered whether their port, the beating heart of Kenya's economy, might become the center of unnecessary political friction. For decades, Kenya had built its identity as the region's logistics hub, a reliable gateway for landlocked neighbors. The idea that a sitting president claimed ownership over the Indian Ocean felt not only absurd but potentially destabilizing. Some feared it might embolden fringe groups or trigger nationalist rhetoric that the government would then have to manage carefully. Politically, the impact was immediate and unavoidable. Within the East African community, EAC Museveni's remarks sparked quiet but serious discussions about the bloc's long-term unity. Leaders in Rwanda and South Sudan privately questioned whether the region could sustain cohesion if one member openly threatened conflict over an internationally recognized maritime zone. Tanzania, with its own memories of past wars with Uganda, adopted a cautious stance, neither condemning nor supporting Museveni, but watching closely. Inside Uganda, the political consequences were even more pronounced. Opposition parties seized upon the remarks as evidence of a government losing its grip on rational policymaking. One prominent critic argued that the president's words were a symptom of the political exhaustion that inevitably comes after decades in power. Younger voters, most of whom did not live through the earlier conflicts with Tanzania, expressed discomfort with a leader invoking war at a time when the region is striving for economic integration. Their frustration hinted at a generational divide that Museveni's campaign could no longer ignore. There were also security concerns that simmered beneath the surface. Kenya's defense analysts quietly assessed the risk of misunderstandings along shared borders or on Lake Victoria, where joint patrols require delicate coordination. A single misinterpretation, they warned, could escalate into a confrontation that neither country truly wanted. Yet perhaps the most profound consequence was psychological. Museveni's remarks forced East Africans to confront a truth they rarely speak aloud: that the colonial-era borders dividing their nations were never designed for stability. A landlocked country like Uganda remains structurally vulnerable, dependent on the goodwill of its neighbors. And in moments of political pressure, especially during heated campaigns, leaders may reach for rhetoric that resonates emotionally but threatens the fragile fabric of regional peace. By the time the dust settled, one thing was clear. Even without a single shot fired, Museveni's words had exposed just how interdependent and how fragile the lives of millions in East Africa truly are. From Washington to Geneva, Museveni's remarks did not go unnoticed. In foreign policy circles, they triggered a quiet but intense round of discussions, not because the United States or the United Nations expected a real naval conflict in East Africa, but because the words exposed deeper structural vulnerabilities in a region the world depends on more than it realizes. In U.S. strategic briefings, analysts immediately focused on the location of the crisis Mombasa, a port through which billions of dollars of global trade pass every year. American companies rely on stable shipping routes running from the Gulf through the Indian Ocean and into East Africa. Any disruption, even a symbolic one, could cascade across supply chains. For older policymakers who remember the Cold War era, where African ports became strategic chess pieces, Museveni's remarks were a reminder of how quickly rhetoric can reopen geopolitical cracks the world thought were sealed. Experts in Washington did not interpret Museveni's words as a literal claim to the ocean. Instead, they saw them as a symptom of a broader tension across Africa, leaders grappling with the limits of borders drawn by colonial powers. The U.S. State Department stressed privately that stability in East Africa depends on predictability, something Museveni's comments threatened even unintentionally. For American diplomats, the question wasn't whether Museveni would start a war. It was whether his words might encourage other leaders across the continent to push territorial narratives for political gain. Internationally, the reaction was centered around law, specifically the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS. Legal scholars reiterated that landlocked countries like Uganda have guaranteed access to the sea through peaceful transit, not ownership, and never through force. Geneva-based experts emphasized that any attempt to redefine maritime rights could destabilize global norms. Their concern wasn't about Uganda alone, it was about setting a precedent that other frustrated nations might try to copy. Meanwhile, African political thinkers abroad, especially in Europe and the diaspora, raised uncomfortable questions. Was Museveni's outburst a sign of deeper economic insecurity? Were landlocked African nations feeling increasingly cornered as global supply chains shifted? Some pointed to tensions in Ethiopia, South Sudan, and Rwanda as signs that the continent's demand for fairer access to trade routes is growing louder. Museveni's language, however reckless, had cracked open a conversation African policymakers often hold privately, but seldom articulate on the global stage. In contrast to Museveni's approach, several international commentators highlighted the leadership style emerging from countries like Burkina Faso under President Ibrahim Traoré. They noted that while Traoré speaks passionately about sovereignty, he grounds his message in negotiation, regional cooperation, and adherence to international norms, an approach many Western analysts privately consider more sustainable in the long run. This comparison fueled yet another layer of debate: which model of African leadership will shape the continent's future, confrontational or cooperative? Ultimately, the global reaction converged around one central theme: East Africa matters. Its sea routes matter, its stability matters, and its leaders' words matter. The international community understood that Museveni's statement did not represent an immediate threat, but it did expose a deeper fragility that the world, especially the United States, cannot afford to ignore. As the uproar over Museveni's remarks slowly faded from the headlines, a heavier, more enduring question settled across East Africa, one that cannot be dismissed by diplomatic statements or campaign speeches. What happens to a region when its stability depends so heavily on the restraint of aging leaders, unpredictable politics, and borders that were never designed to serve the people who live within them? For the families in Kampala who fear price hikes, for the fishermen in Mombasa who depend on the sea, for the truck drivers who keep East Africa moving, Museveni's words were not just rhetoric. They were a reminder of how fragile peace can be when national frustrations collide with regional dependence. Stability in East Africa has always been like a thread stretched tightly between nations. A careless tug, even just a word, can make it tremble. And the warning does not end with Uganda and Kenya. Across the continent, similar pressures are building. Landlocked countries demand fairer access to trade. Coastal nations feel overburdened. Old alliances strain under new economic realities. This moment, sparked by one man's declaration that the ocean belongs to me, exposes a much deeper truth. Africa is entering a period where the balance between sovereignty and cooperation will be tested more than ever. This is why the world, especially the United States, must pay attention. Not because war is coming tomorrow, but because the structural tensions beneath these borders are real. The next decade will define whether East Africa becomes a region of partnership or a region of repeated confrontation. And that decision will depend on leaders who understand not just power, but responsibility. It is here that many observers draw comparisons with emerging leadership models across the continent. In places like Burkina Faso, President Ibrahim Traoré speaks fiercely about sovereignty, but pairs it with unity, regional dialogue, and a refusal to threaten neighbors. Whether one agrees with him or not, this contrast invites an important question for Africans and for the world. Which path leads to a safer, more stable future, one built on threats or one built on cooperation and reform? So now I turn the final question to you. Do you believe Museveni's words were simply election theatrics, or a sign that East Africa is entering a dangerous, uncertain chapter? Please share your thoughts below. Your voice helps build a community that values truth over echo chambers. And if you want to stay ahead of Africa news long before it reaches the mainstream, please consider subscribing. Share this video with someone who cares about East Africa's sovereignty and the future of leadership on the continent.